This computer. Okay.
Welcome to the Breaking into Athletic Performance podcast. This is episode 4, technically. We're doing a little bit of a mini series here where Ryan and I just get on and talk about actually developing characteristics and little things in the field of strength conditioning rather than bringing on guests and talking about the field. We're going to be talking more in depth on how we do things and how things might work. So I'm your host, Christian Chofi, as always, except for the last episode. And here with Ryan Smack. Ryan, introduce yourself.
Hey guys, Ryan Smack here again. Like Christian said, this is going to be a little different. We're going to tackle energy system development today, also known as conditioning. So hopefully you guys can get a little bit out of this. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So we'll jump right in here. So our first topic is going to be just an overview of the energy systems. So there's 3 energy systems: the ATP PC system, which stands for adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system. Some people call it the creatine phosphate system. It's the same thing. Then there's the glycolytic system, and there's the aerobic or oxidative system. So talking about the ATP PC system, this is the system that creates energy that lasts 1 to 10 seconds roughly. So this is your high intensity work. This is not your long duration work. Obviously 10 seconds is a very short amount of time, and the system can only maintain ATP regeneration for that amount of time. So when we're talking about ATP generation, we're talking about the actual chemical action of creating ATP, and then energy is released when you break ATP back down and you're splitting that phosphate off of the ADP, or splitting it potentially into AMP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate and adenosine monophosphate, respectively. So without getting into that too much, move on to the glycolytic system. This system lasts, it creates energy for roughly 30 seconds to a minute 30. There's a little bit of crossover there between the ATP PC system and the glycolytic system, from 30 to 60 seconds, or also 10 to 30 seconds. So it's not like it switches over immediately to a different system once you hit a certain amount of time. The next system, the last system, would be the aerobic or the oxidative system. And this system takes over around 2 minutes. Again, there's crossover from minute 30 to 2 minutes. And this system can produce energy for very long amounts of time. And also it's technically always running, because it's called the oxidative system for a reason. So when you're just sitting around, you're still breathing, right? Maybe a lot less than if you're exercising, but you're still breathing. So the way I talk about it is the aerobic system's always on, like a car that's idling. So you turn your car on and put it in drive, but you don't touch the gas. That's the aerobic system that's on. And then let's say the gas pedal is your aerobic system, and you press the gas and you can only go up to 100 miles an hour approximately. Let's say that, for example. So you have it always on, but you can also put the gas on, burn a little more oxygen, and go a little faster. Now let's assume that the glycolytic system is your nitro, right? So you press your nitro and it can last for 30 seconds, but you're not using gas at that point, or oxygen, but it's still on. It's like in the idling, right? And then your ATP PC system is like your turbo. So you put your turbo on, and your turbo can go for about 10 seconds, but that's going to be the fastest you can go. And your aerobic system is still idling. So Ryan, I don't know if there's anything I missed there, or something else I should go over, but
I thought those analogies were pretty on point. Like Christian said, the aerobic system or the oxidative system is always going to be on. So something that a lot of people don't take into consideration is when you're doing any sort of work for the other 2 energy systems, and then you either stationarily recover, where you're not moving, where you do some sort of low intensity active recovery, your oxidative system is still on when you're not using the other two. So that's still going to be going, just like if you turn that car on and you're sitting at a red light, but you haven't turned the car off, it's just always going to be running and ready to go into other systems that will produce that energy a lot quicker. That's kind of going to segue into our next talking point about this, which is how we develop each one of them. Just like Christian did, I'm going to start with the ATP PCR system. A lot of people overcomplicate this stuff, in my opinion. Christian told you guys it'll last from 2 to 10 seconds roughly. So in order to develop that system, all you need to do is a maximal output for that amount of time, and it's going to rely primarily on your stored ATP, your stored phosphocreatine, and some free creatine that will be able to rapidly be turned back into PCR and ATP. Something that people can kind of screw up with their ATP PCR system development is they will not rest for long enough. As a general rule, something that I do is I try to at least have a 1 to 10 work to rest ratio. So that means if I work for 6 seconds as hard as I can, trying to target that ATP PCR system, I need to rest for at least 60 seconds. Like I said, that's the minimum. That will give your body enough time to replenish the majority of that stored ATP and the stored PCR, so it's ready to use a lot of it again. Obviously, if you rest longer than that 1 to 10 ratio, let's say you make it 1 to 15 or 1 to 20, instead of replenishing 85 to 90% of that stored amount, you might be able to replenish a lot closer to 100. So like I said, you need to really pay attention to your rest length in addition to your work length. Just like the ATP PCR system, the glycolytic system is going to be worked by trying to target that 30-second to 1.5 minute window. Sorry about that. Get my cat down real quick. So if you're trying to work on your glycolytic system, the easiest thing to do is a 30-second maximal output. Again, you're trying to target that time window. And with the glycolytic system, when I try to do that type of work, I'll usually include a 1 to 5 work to rest ratio. Obviously, when you're in a glycolytic state with your work, you are going to produce hydrogen ions, which is what causes that burning sensation or that acidosis that people like to say is from lactic acid, but it's really your hydrogen ions creating an acidic environment. So that's really going to cause a lot of the fatigue. If you rest too long, that acidic environment is going to kind of be cleared from your bloodstream. So you won't necessarily be working glycolytic capacity, which is going to be different than glycolytic power. But because you're still doing a 30-second bout, you're really going to work on that maximal energy output that you can get within that bout if it's only 30 seconds. But if you want to work capacity, you might shorten the rest intervals, or you might try to increase your work interval time closer to that 1.5 minute kind of back end mark, because you're going to be trying to produce energy through that system for a longer duration if it's 1.5 minutes versus 30 seconds, obviously. The last one is that aerobic system. That's going to be anything that's really longer than 2 minutes. The pace is going to need to be a lot lower than that glycolytic or ATP PCR work. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can do the typical low intensity, steady state, long duration work. That will typically be cardiac output work where you're trying to improve the efficiency of your cardiovascular system. A more sport specific way might be trying to do interval training, where you might do 1 minute on, 1 minute off at a higher intensity that's a little closer to glycolytic, but those shorter rest times are going to make it aerobic, which is going to kind of auto regulate that intensity that you can keep during your work bout. So Like I said, there's a lot of ways that you can attack stuff like that. Like I just said, the aerobic and the glycolytic, and then the glycolytic and the ATP PCR system all kind of intertwine and they intersect. And when you change intensities, regardless of how long you've been going, you're going to tap into a different percentage of that energy system. So Christian can kind of take it from there if I missed anything.
That was pretty good. One thing I just wanted to reiterate is the work to rest ratios. So you can develop the aerobic system and you might only do 20 seconds of work if you're doing 20 or seconds less of rest. Yeah, it might take a little bit before you start getting into that, before you start using the aerobic system exclusively, but you're still doing aerobic work if you're using a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-1/2 or even like 0 is continuous work to rest ratio. And the same goes for the other systems to a degree. The ATP PC system, you're not going to be working that system if you work for 2 minutes and take 20 minutes off. That's not how it works. Same thing with glycolytic. But yeah, for the most part, if you're just worried about your work to rest ratios, you're going to hit the right system. So it's important to know what those are and how to implement them in your conditioning. Another thing would be each system has capacity and power. So ATP PC system capacity would be your ability to sprint at high velocities multiple times. So if you sprint really fast once, then you have high ATP PC power. If you can sprint at that high velocity multiple times and your speed doesn't drop off, that's capacity. So it goes the same for the other two. The aerobic system is one that people overlook that quite a bit. They think that all they need to train is capacity, so they just do continuous, long duration, slow exercise like that, and that's only training capacity. So if you're familiar with VO2 max, the amount of oxygen you can consume, if you're just doing that continuous training at low intensity, your VO2 max isn't going to increase and you're not going to be able to produce high amounts of work for long periods of time. You'll only be able to produce low intensity levels of work for a very long period of time. But let's say in a soccer game, you've been running for 20 minutes already, you're using your aerobic system. If you try to turn it on for a couple minutes and work at a higher rate, you haven't been training aerobic power, then your performance is going to suffer. So that'll lead us into the next topic, which is just developing them together and how they interact. And there's been some clarification recently that they don't work against each other as much as we originally thought. So if you take a look at the aerobic system and the ATP PC system, they actually work together fairly well to a degree. We used to think that if you're doing one or the other, it's going to completely disintegrate all of your effort in the other system. For instance, the aerobic system, we used to think that if you're doing aerobic work almost at all, that's going to hurt your ATP PC system, because what aerobic work does is decrease your muscle fiber size. And the reason for that is to decrease the diffusion distance so oxygen can get in the cell faster. And if your muscle fibers are smaller, you're going to be weaker and slower. It's obvious. Larger people are generally stronger. So one thing to add with that is we recently, I mean, not super recently, but it's been kind of confirmed that if you're doing moderate levels of aerobic work, you're not going to hurt your ATP PC system. So most of the studies done on that, on aerobic work hurting the ATP PC or glycolytic system, were studies where they were cross-country skiers in Sweden and they were training aerobically hard for 3 years. And this is an actual study. So you can't really trust that, because your athletes, that's not what they're doing unless it's a completely aerobic sport like cross-country, or they're distance swimmers, or they're rowers, which rowing is even quite glycolytic. And then recently we've also discovered that the glycolytic system doesn't really interact well with the other two. And for that reason, there's been a little bit of a push to remove glycolytic work, not completely, but to a degree. And I don't want to jump the gun in saying that it's wrong to remove it completely, because I believe there's a time and place for it, but there seems to be a competition between the glycolytic system and the other two systems, whereas the other two interact with each other a little bit better than we originally thought. The reason being, it appears that the glycolytic system competes with enzymes for the other two, specifically the ATP PC system, and that might be the reason that if you're training one, it's harder to train the other. One thing I also wanted to add about the glycolytic system is that when you're training the glycolytic system, those something to do, I don't know exactly, something to do with the way you're training, that zaps your immune system harder than the other two systems. So each system kind of has its day. The ATP PC system, when you're working that hard, that zaps your central nervous system. When you're working the glycolytic system hard, that zaps your immune system. When you're working the aerobic system hard, it just puts strain on your muscles and potentially your bones and joints. So you need to train all of them, obviously, but there is a time and place, and you need to be strategic about how you're training them. So let's say you have a team that just finished their season. They just finished their 2 weeks of rest right after the season, and you're getting ready to get them into the off season. Personally, what I like to do, if you have freshmen coming in, is develop that aerobic base, because it takes the longest amount of time to develop that. So you want to get it done and get it started as early as you can. The aerobic base, the reason it takes so long is because it takes a long time for you to create mitochondria, which is what creates ATP aerobically, and also capillary density. That takes a long time to develop. So you want to get that aerobic system base built up. Personally, then, it depends on the sport, what you're going to move into next. I like to start getting speed work in as soon as possible, because that also can take a long time to develop, especially if you have kids that their form is just atrocious. So they might take a long time to teach, and therefore it's going to take a long time to see if they're actually getting faster from your training. The glycolytic work can be put on the back burner, and it's okay to just train it maybe a month before they get back to campus. Another thing we need to talk about is how, the not diminishing returns, but the life of each system. So when I say that, I mean how long you can go without training the system that you can still keep those adaptations. So for the aerobic system, it's a very long time. It's roughly a month, right, Ryan?
Yeah, I believe the number is like 30 plus or minus 5 days off the
Yeah,
top
it's
of my head, but
yeah, exactly. It's roughly
yeah.
a month. So once you build your aerobic base, you really don't have to worry about it too much. I mean, check back to it more than once a month, but once you build it, you're in pretty good shape, and you're not going to have to worry about it too much. The glycolytic system is about half that. It's roughly 2 weeks, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. So you're going to have to check back to that more often if you have a glycolytic sport. If you don't have a glycolytic sport, you don't have to worry about it too much. Ryan's going to talk about how most practices are actually pretty glycolytic. So then the ATP PC system, the life is less than a week. So if you're not sprinting at least bare minimum once a week, your speed is going to suffer. And you might not necessarily get a lot slower, but you're not going to get faster. That is for certain. So you need to be sprinting at least once a week. In my opinion, 3 times a week is perfect. You don't need to go crazy. You can go out and do 3 10-yard sprints as long as it's max effort and you're trying to move as fast as possible. You're going to keep those adaptations. So Ryan, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how practices are usually set up and and why we don't always need to check back to certain energy systems at certain times.
Yeah. So, like Christian said, the glycolytic system can kind of interfere with the other two systems. I just wanted to add something quick to go along with his points on that. In addition to that immune system fatigue Christian was talking about, I think this push to remove the glycolytic system is largely due to Charlie Francis's high-low model that he uses, where he states that the high intensity like ATP PCR work is obviously central nervous system driven, just like Christian said. That aerobic work, so that lower intensity work, is not. So that aerobic work allows your central nervous system to recover, which is important for every single speed and power based sport. Um, in addition to the glycolytic system being harder on your immune system, it is difficult enough to require more than that 24-hour recovery period for your central nervous system. So it might get in the way of the power and that speed work that you're trying to do the next day, but it's too low of an intensity to drive up those maximal outputs. So like I said, that's kind of another argument about why people remove that. The part that I'm going to add to it as well is if you look at sports that are glycolytic, their practices are glycolytic because that's the nature of the sport. So if you look at tennis, for example, depending on the length of the rally, that definitely becomes glycolytic in nature quite frequently. And if you look at the way they practice, usually it will be go, 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 go for much longer than a typical rally will last, and it's all high intensity. So that becomes extremely glycolytic, and that's very taxing on the body when you're doing that at practice every day. Obviously, when you're in season, that's happening all the time. Even during their off-season period, you have, like if tennis is a spring sport, you have that 8-hour window in college where you have fall practices. So usually they're still getting that at least 3 times a week. That kind of makes it not as important for us as strength and conditioning coaches to hit that while they're doing it in their sport. Chris Borthwick at Wake Forest talks about this idea of training above and below the demands of the sport in order to complement what they're doing in practice. So even if you have a glycolytic sport, if you're able to improve that maximal output that they're able to do, I'm going to use speed as an example because it's the easiest thing to think of. If you have an athlete that goes 20 miles an hour and their sport requires them to go at 12 miles an hour frequently, and then you all of a sudden raise their top speed from 20 to 24, that 12 miles an hour is all of a sudden a lower relative intensity to what their maximum capability is. So that lower relative intensity is no longer as taxing on them. So you're working above the demands of the sport, trying to improve their ability to have a higher output. In between those bouts of the 12 miles per hour or whatever the number is that they're constantly doing, during their rest periods, they need to recover. And like we already hit, that recovery is going to be aerobic in nature because you're walking back to the line. There might be like a quick timeout in basketball or something like that. So you're resting and you're trying to breathe, and that's going to largely be your aerobic system. So even in a glycolytic sport, you already worked above the demands with trying to improve that max output. Improving their recovery ability is going to be improving their aerobic system so that they're able to more quickly get back into a more neutral or natural state in between those glycolytic bouts instead of maintaining that acidosis that happens, acidosis, which is really the hydrogen ions, and the elevated heart rate and their elevated oxygen consumption rate that creates that feeling of fatigue and like, oh no, I need to slow down. So that's kind of my take on why glycolytic preparation doesn't necessarily need to be a huge point of focus. But like Christian said, especially if you have a glycolytic sport where you need repeat sprint ability, you need to hit that at some point before they're required to do it in practice. Otherwise, they're not prepared for those first few weeks of practice, especially in like a training camp scenario. But if you prepare your aerobic system and you prepare your max outputs leading up to those couple weeks that you are going to address the glycolytic work, usually you'll be able to address that in like a 2 to 3 week time, and they'll be accustomed to that type of work, so they're ready to go once practice starts.
Yeah, a couple things I wanted to add there is, so first of all, if you have a skill sport, I strongly encourage you not to be conditioning in season anyway. If you have a non-skill sport, so an aerobic sport like cross country, they're going to be conditioning in practice, so you don't need to worry about it. You're pretty much just working the weight room for them at that point. The only thing I would do with a skill sport, if they don't reach max velocity very often in practice, after they warm up at practice, they hit a couple sprints, very short, tons of rest, and then they get into practice. That's all I would be doing. Another thing is you, as a strength coach, one, do no harm is our number one job. Two is prevent injuries if possible. And three, everyone says, is prepare athletes for the demands of the sport. I would argue that we're trying to prepare athletes above the demands of the sport so that the sport feels almost easy in comparison. So if we try to eliminate glycolytic work from a glycolytic sport, they're not going to be overly prepared. They're just going to be moderately prepared from practice. So like I said, we're not going to be conditioning in season. But if we don't push above the intensity or the duration that they're going to deal with in their sport, then they're not going to be as prepared as we want them to be. So it's not necessarily about just preparing them above and below. It's preparing them over top of what is actually necessary in the sport. I don't know if Ryan even agrees with that, but that's what I think. So he can dispute it now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people talk about this thing that they call like the worst case scenario in your sport, where it might not happen, but if it does, that's where you're probably going to get injured because you're not prepared for it. So, like Christian said, if you create like a buffer of preparedness where you're able to handle more than you typically would, that hopefully will take care of that risk of going into like some sort of fatigue that you're unaccustomed to, where things start to break down, and that creates a situation where there might be injury. But like Christian said, we want to try to mitigate the risk of injury occurring, which means we need to prepare them for worst case scenario of what happens in their sport. If you're taking a extra long shift on the ice in hockey, or you're playing basketball and you go into 6 overtimes or whatever it is.
Yeah, for sure. And then another thing would be is at the end of the day, sometimes we need to be managers. So like I said, we're not going to be conditioning in season, but even in the off season, if coaches are absolutely crushing them, then we need to shift our conditioning to a degree too. So if coaches just absolutely got after them that day, we might not even condition. If they're just working really hard but practice was short, maybe we'll hit the aerobic system that day. If they had a long practice but they didn't do any high intensity work, they're already fatigued, so the ATP system is probably shot, but we're going to try to hit that later in the week if we can. So unfortunately, we don't have free reign over sport coaches, and I'm sure everyone knows that, but it can be more than you actually believe when you first get your own team. So you just got to be prepared for that, and be prepared to work around the sport coach, because they are not going to work around you ever.
Yeah, we're there to support them and their goals, and obviously the student athletes first and foremost. But the coach is the one running practice. They know the sport. Like Christian said, we're not going to be able to really control them, but that just kind of points to the importance of, you need to be aware of what's going on. So go watch practice, go take notes on what you see, try to communicate with your coach as much as possible. Communicate with the student athletes, because a lot of the times for sport coaches and strength coaches, the way the student athletes receive a training stimulus or a practice and the way it feels on their body is not the way we intend it. And that can be for reasons that are our fault. That can be for many other outside factors that we have no control over. But you just need to constantly communicate, read body language, and try to watch practice and just understand the way things are run when they're at practice or in the training room or everything else that they're doing out there.
Yeah, the best thing you can do is get some data. So just take RPEs. If you have the ability to get out to practice, take RPEs after practice. I mean, you'll find out very quickly which kids are really soft and which kids are just hard as a rock. And then you'll find out where your average lies, and that's probably what's accurate. So data is the most important thing with that. We got a little off track there, but I think that's pretty much all we wanted to talk about. You got anything else?
No, if anyone that watches this has any counter arguments or any unique ways that they do things, please reach out. The whole point of this endeavor is for us to try to learn as much as possible from our guests, from each other, from people who watch it through interaction and stuff. So the more we can learn and interact with you guys, the better. So please reach out if you have any arguments or agreements or just comments in general.
Yeah, please. And if you want to talk about physiology, I am more than happy to do that. I had a really great physiology professor and I love it. I'd love to get into it. If you can teach me something or I can teach you something, I would be absolutely ecstatic to talk physiology. So please reach out to us. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching.
Yep.